So hi, I'll also introduce myself again. I'm Maggie Schuppert, and I'm campaigns director at CURE. And I'm going to be talking about, I'm sure you are all waiting for this, maybe knowing CURE, about CO2 pipelines. Because for those who may have been following our work on this issue, so grateful to have the tech support from Wilder today, because I do not think I could have handled any of this. So those who may have been following CURE's work will know that the CO2 pipelines is where it all really started for us in terms of engaging on this issue of the pipelines, but also the larger issue of carbon capture. It was, in the latter half of 2021 where, CURE staff started hearing about these new pipelines and new projects, these new companies that had new names, hearing it from neighbors at county board meetings down in the southwest part of the state. Very little information about them. And so this is where we dove in. So this is could you advance, John? I might not be clicking correctly. So this is sort of the state of what we're looking at in our particular region with the current proposed plan. Although, as I will get to, I will note that this map is now out of date. But the largest project that has been proposed here in Minnesota is Summit Carbon Solutions. As I said, one of those new unfamiliar names, now pipeline companies, and their Midwest Carbon Express. It has been described by the company as the world's largest CO2 pipeline. It is a multi-state pipeline that covers sort of a large swath of the Midwest region, over 2,000 miles, $5.5 billion project. And it's attached largely to 30 plus, always growing, largely ethanol, other industrial agricultural facilities. Although that, is not something that we should expect to always be the case should these projects progress. In Minnesota, we currently have proposed around 240 miles of pipelines, 3 lateral branches, and currently 6 facilities, though we do expect that to potentially change as well. In part because, as I said, this map is now out of date because one of the other projects that had that was being proposed for this region and had a small branch into Minnesota was canceled about 2 weeks ago due to I think what these the on-the-ground resistance that showed up in the regulatory spaces in all the states that these companies were not expecting, which I think, among other things, also demonstrates that these companies don't have actually a lot of experience with building pipelines, which should make us very nervous. But I do presentations on these projects all the time. I could talk about Summit till the cows come home. But what I'd like to do today is zoom out a little bit because I think I'm going to cover a couple of sort of maybe the misconceptions and fallacies that are held by some folks around these current pipeline projects. And one of them is that I want folks to understand that these current projects that we are facing in the Midwest and in Minnesota are just the precursor to something much bigger. And that is a planned expansion of CO2 pipelines that, should certain interests have their way, will cover tens of thousands of miles of pipeline. This is one planned study out of Princeton University, converting kilometers to miles. That's over 65,000 miles of new pipeline infrastructure that is being proposed. And so, this isn't simply a local issue here in Southwest Minnesota. It is, as I said, the precursor to something much bigger. And why? Why are there folks who want to build this scale of new pipeline infrastructure? Part of that is because the issue of transport is really critical to the larger carbon capture project. As Sarah talked about, that is because the sites for sequestration and use of carbon are often not in the places where we would be capturing them from. And so transporting that is really critical to making this project quote unquote work. It also requires new pipelines because existing pipeline infrastructure can generally not be converted. Oil and gas pipelines, other kinds of pipelines can't be used for carbon because carbon is typically transported in what's known as, not always, but the supercritical phase, which, to make a long story short, requires very high pressures. And so it requires a different kind of pipeline to transport it. And just, to note again, to reiterate, we do have about a little over 5,000 miles of pipelines, of CO2 pipelines in the country today, and those have primarily been developed to meet the needs of the fossil fuel industry for enhanced oil recovery. And that's what some of those blue lines are. And it's been said, and it bears repeating, that is where this industry has come from and where it is currently going as well, is to meet the needs of the fossil fuel industry. There are just, want to make note, as I said, the current projects, these are new companies, new names, but I don't think we should expect that to be seen because there are the familiar names and companies that we know are already working on these things in other parts of the country because they see the huge opportunity for new infrastructure build out and all the money that is behind that. And so I think that's something we should be keeping our eye on for, to see the familiar names of Enbridge and TC Energy, who are actually are part of the new hydrogen hub project that was proposed. So those pipeline companies that have a track record of building pipelines, but a track record of a whole lot more as well when it comes to problematic impacts on land, water, and people's lands and livelihoods. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because others have actually covered it, but this is just another reason why we are now seeing, with an industry that has been around for quite some time, a huge explosion in interest. Part of that is the urgency of the climate crisis, but also that's because there's a lot of money floating around to incentivize this, whether it be low carbon fuel standards like the one they have in California and a few other states, and is being discussed right now in Minnesota. The infrastructure bill had quite a lot of money for carbon capture and infrastructure. And of course, as others have mentioned, the IRA was a game changer in terms of expanding the existing 45Q tax credit, which made it so previously the projects associated with, say, the ethanol industry under the previous version of 45Q would still be profitable because it is comparatively cheaper to capture carbon from ethanol facilities. But with the expansion of 45Q, it has made this endeavor a windfall profit for all sorts of industries because there's so much money potentially coming from the IRA to support carbon capture and the creation of additional emissions to be captured, which I will get to. So to get to the next misconception, which is actually sort of a two-parter, is the argument that we need this rapid expansion of pipelines to facilitate the expansion of this industry, which is needed because our emissions issues and our climate issue is so severe, and we just need to get this stuff working and expanded and operational as quickly as possible. As I said, this is a two-parter, one of those, and I think, I want to bring this up because I do think this is a sincere question for a lot of folks that we do have, we talk about a lot about, we might not like carbon capture on a coal plant, but what about those quote unquote hard to abate sectors that we are still figuring out how we could potentially reduce their emissions. And so we need this pipeline in the ground to facilitate the use of carbon capture at those places. And what I would say to that is that's not actually how infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure works. These things aren't modular, they're not interchangeable. If you are building a pipeline from an ethanol plant to a oil field, that's what it's going to be used for. It doesn't actually provide you much support to do carbon capture, say, at a cement facility. It is just, we don't get a lot of learning or support for those things we could argue and discuss whether we'll actually need them for. And I encourage folks, we do have a civil engineer as one of our other speakers to sort of pose that question to her as well, because she might be a more authoritative perspective on that. The other part of this question, though, that I think about the urgency, the need to roll out these pipelines to meet the urgency of the crisis, is that massive pipeline deployment in combination with the 45Q tax credit will do nothing to reduce the production of emissions, which is what all the experts say we need to do, including the IPCC, the IEA, and all of these other expert opinions that say, first and foremost, this is what we need to do, is decrease the production of emissions. And this combination is actually intended to increase production. This is, I think, very aligned with what Jeremy was saying in his presentation, that with this kind of pipeline network, in combination with these payments for producing carbon dioxide, capturing some portion of it, feeding it to a fossil fuel industry, which, as we have demonstrated, is hungry for CO2 to advanced enhanced oil recovery, or potentially capturing some portion of it, because no carbon capture project captures all of the emissions, and potentially storing some of it in the ground for some portion of time. So this is, as Jeremy said, a production incentive scenario. And I think we need to be really clear that that is what this kind of pipeline network is going to do and what it's intended for, to be perfectly honest. And so my final fallacy, I started this off by saying that I wanted folks to understand that this wasn't just a local issue, but I don't want anyone to think that that is me saying that these local issues are not of incredible importance to us at CURE, and I would hope to everyone in this room. The local concerns with pipelines are manifold. Some folks will talk a little bit more about the impacts on land and water, but I just really want to highlight some of the safety and risks associated with these new kind of pipelines that have demonstrated to be fairly risky or incredibly risky. CO2 is an asphyxiant. It has certain properties that make it very dangerous in certain geographical conditions. As I said, it has unique risks and challenges for first responders. The combination of carbon dioxide and water creates carbonic acid. And I'm gonna maybe let Peg speak about that a little bit more. But I think one thing you hear a lot from the industry and from its allies is that there have been no fatalities due to CO2 pipeline failures in recent history, but the qualifiers in that sentence are really important. Yes, there have not been recent fatalities, but there have been very near fatalities, including in a recent, in 2020, there was a pipeline rupture in a small, low wealth, underinvested, predominantly Black town in rural Mississippi called Satartia. A pipeline that was owned by Denbury, which has now been sold to Chevron, ruptured. 45 people were hospitalized, many of them with long-term severe health impacts. And I really want to highlight this because I think both what happened in Satartia and also the desire to stop talking about it, to brush it aside, to dismiss the impacts is just such a stark example of environmental racism that we need to keep talking about that and learn the lessons from it, because these folks are still suffering the consequences. The other thing I want to say about concern for local impacts is just a reminder that every place we want to build these pipelines, people live there, they work there, they have jobs, they have families, they have farms, And often these are the same places that we want to build all sorts of other kinds of infrastructure, whether it be transmission lines, whether it be solar arrays, wind turbines. And, I just think we really need to keep in mind what we are asking from folks and really be considered about what balance we are trying to strike when we're asking folks to take on this huge change in terms of infrastructure build out and the changes to the landscape and the changes to the communities, and be really considered as we are developing these pathways forward to carbon free, and to keep these local concerns in mind, because they matter to the people that live there and they should matter to us as well, for all the reasons that I've spoken about.